Welcome back, chess fans. In today's episode, we're diving into 25 opening principles in chess. From general tips to common mistakes you should avoid, this video will serve as a complete guideline for navigating the opening phase of the game. Sit back, take notes, and let's get started. Enjoy the video. I want to start this video off with an important concept that you need to keep in mind before you start using these principles. And I guess you can call this principle number 0. In chess, good players know how to follow these principles, and great players know when it is time to break them. Every principle in this video will have exceptions. Some of them will have more exceptions than others, and in order for you to understand when to break these principles, you first need to go through the process of understanding why these principles are so effective. Now that we got that out of the way, let's talk about the actual chess principles. Principle number 1, control the center. On the chessboard, the most important squares are d4, e4, d5, and e5. If we are permitted, we should put both of our pawns on these two squares, d4 and e4. Now, most of the times, our opponents will respond appropriately and they will not allow us to put two pawns in the center. However, when we are able to, we should. Because what this does is it, first of all, opens up both bishops completely. It also opens up the queen, and it allows for our knights to develop to the center of the board without being harassed. So for example, if black develops the knight to f6, we can always attack it with e5. If black develops the knight to c6, we can always attack it with d5. So black really doesn't have a lot of opportunities to develop without having any issues. Now, as for us, we are able to do that freely. Also, when you have the whole center, you are able to decide on which side of the board battle takes place. So for example, if you are able to push e5 and if you're able to get a structure like this where the pawns are on b2, let's presume that we play c3, b2, c3, d4, e5, our pawn chain is looking this way, so we are able to just generate an attack on the king side. Usually the king is castled over on this side of the board. However, a lot of times we can push d5 and then start a queenside attack with moves like c4 and c5 with a proper setup, of course. So having the whole center gives us a lot of flexibility. And also, central pawns are inherently more valuable than the flank pawns because they control more squares and also more important squares than the flank pawns such as h and the a pawn. So principle number 2 is develop your pieces. Once we put a pawn in the center and two pawns in the center if we can, we want to be looking towards our minor pieces such as our knights and our bishops in order to get them into play. Now, how do we develop these pieces and where do we actually develop them? And here is when principle number 3 comes into play. And according to principle number 3, pieces near the center of the board are more valuable than pieces away from the center. Now, why is this so important? If we were to put the knight on f3, this is a very good square. We're controlling, we're attacking the pawn on e5. We're also supporting the d4 pawn push. We're controlling these two squares, which is very good. If we were to put the knight on h3 instead, this would be very useless because what squares are we controlling? f4 and g5. But these squares are not really useful, not right away at least. It could become useful down the road, but right now they're not really that relevant. Same goes with this knight. If we develop it to c3, great, we're defending our e4 pawn. We are also putting some extra pressure on d5, not allowing our opponent to go for the d5 pawn break so easily. If we were to put the knight on a3, first of all, it can get captured, but secondly, it also controls very useless squares, b5 and c4. We have no need to put the knight on either of these squares, so it's not really that useful to go with knight to a3. Now, that's why we develop towards the central. Centralized pieces are better than pieces on the edge. For bishops, it's a little bit different because there are some scenarios where they can be on the edge and they are long-range pieces. So it's actually okay for them to be on the edge because they're still controlling massive chunks of the board. However, for knights specifically, you want to be developing them towards the center. Bishops also, but as I said, with bishops, there can be some exceptions. Now, next up, what I want to talk about is principle number 4, and that is to develop knights before bishops. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, this principle is probably my least favorite principle of all of the ones that I'm going to talk about today, just because it's such a generic principle and it's not always the most effective. So for example, in a lot of openings, you just want to bring out the bishop first, and maybe you don't even want to block your c-pawn in a lot of positions. And in my opinion, this is something that we tell beginners, but it's not necessarily something that's best for every position, and something that's even best for a lot of positions. There are so many exceptions to this. Like for example, bishop to c4 is the Italian opening here, and this is an exception because we're not developing knights before bishops. We just moved this bishop out to c4 without developing this b1 knight. So if I were you, I would take some liberty with this principle. If you are an absolute beginner, you just started playing chess, in that case this is totally okay, but if you want to get better, you're gonna have to realize that sometimes developing bishops is better. So take some liberty with this, but I still wanted to include this in the video just because it's said so commonly. It's one of the most commonly said principles, so I wanted to include it anyways. Now the next principle though, which is very, very useful, is to develop the bishops outside of the pawn chain. So here, as you can see, we put the bishop on c4 or bishop to b5. This is the Spanish, but bishop to c4 or bishop to b5. But what we want to do mainly is get this bishop outside of the pawn chain. If we were to play a move like bishop to e2, after a couple of moves, you're going to realize that if we play a move like pawn to d3, our bishop is stuck on e2, which is very solid, but it's also not the most active, and generally we would like to avoid this. That's why we would like to put the bishop on c4 and play d3 later on, not later on, but play d3 and then get the other bishop out later on. So here, pawn to d3, knight to f6, and let me just make a couple of developing moves, castles, and now we develop the other bishop. Once we have brought out our light square bishop, now we can develop this dark square bishop as well. After we are done doing this, or during the process, there's also another principle that you have to know, and that's going to be principle number 6. Let me just make a couple of moves here. And principle number 6 is castle the king. It's very, very, very important to castle the king because fundamentally, when you're in the center of the board, you can be attacked from 3 different directions. For example, there can be a rook on e8, this bishop can attack you from this side, this bishop can attack you on this side, but if you're on the edge of the board, you completely eliminate one side of the board. There's nothing that can happen on the queen side anymore, and the only place where you can be attacked is on the king side, or perhaps in the center, which is a bit more indirect. Opening up the center could enable the attack on the king. So at maximum, there are 2 sides where you can be attacked. There's not 3 sides. So fundamentally, the king, when it is castled, is always going to be safer than the king in the center of the board. Principle number 7 is develop your queen and connect the rooks. So for example, in this position, you want to play a move like queen to e2, which develops the queen to a very useful square because it sets up the e4 pawn break in the future, but it also connects the rooks, which is very important. And once we are able to do this, we can bring the rooks to the center of the board. And this actually ties into the next principle that I'm going to talk about, which is to bring the rooks to the open file. So here, I understand that this is not an opening position, but I want to illustrate a specific idea, which is that rooks love the open files. So in this case, we have pawns on the squares where the C and D files are open, and the rook can freely infiltrate you. As we know, rooks love the 7th rank. They love activity and open files. Now, on the same note, rooks also love semi-open files. So in this case, in a position like this, there are no open files. However, the E file is semi-open because there's one white pawn on the board and there's no black pawn. So we play a move like rook to E8, putting the rook on a semi-open file. In a move or two, we will move this bishop away and the rook will have full control over the e4 square. So remember, rooks love the open and semi-open files. So going back to a position like this, for example, what you want to do is put the rooks on the squares where you anticipate the files to open up. You want to put them on the files where you anticipate those files to open up. So for example, most of the time you are going to want to bring the A rook to D1 and the F rook to E1 because you are anticipating these two files to open up, the D and E files. That also goes in E4 positions. There's going to be some queen's pawn positions like such as Queen's Gambit where you bring the rook to C1, the A rook to C1 and the F rook to D1, but of course that depends on the opening. But the fundamental idea of bringing the rooks is that you want to bring them where the files are going to open up. Principle number 9, learn the correct squares for your pieces. So for example, in this position, we have the knights developed to c3 and f3, we have the bishop on e2, and we also have the king castled. Now, how do we know where to put our pieces and how do we know where to proceed? Do we put the bishop on e3? Do we put the bishop on g5? Do we put the bishop on f4? Do we bring the rook to e1? Do we put the queen on c2? Do we bring the bishop out and put the queen on d2? These are all key details that will change the course of the game. So whenever you're studying the opening, you have to learn the correct squares for each pieces. So for example, in this opening, this knight from f3 reroutes itself to d2 and c4. Also, the pawn goes to h3 and bishop goes to f4 to pressure the pawn on d6 and to have a hiding square on h2. These are all key details that you have to know about the position. Of course, this is a specific example, but definitely whenever you're learning a new opening, learn the correct squares for each of the pieces. Principle number 10, if you don't know what to do, focus on development. So in this position, as you can see, we have the knight, two bishops developed, and also we have castled the king. Now, I gave this position to 3 of my students and all of them told me the same thing. They were all thinking about the same exact move, which is not a very good move. And the move that is in question is knight to d7. Going back with the knight and attacking this bishop on e5. Now, why is this not a good move? Well, it's actually for quite a simple reason, and that's because you're not making any progress in the position. Knight d7 is just a one move attacking move, and after the bishop goes back, you haven't made any progress in the position. Actually, if anything, you made the positioning of your knight worse, and you made the positioning of the bishop slightly better. Now, instead of that, what you have to do in this position is look at your pieces and understand which pieces are developed. The ones that are highlighted in green, these are all developed pieces, and the ones that are highlighted in red, the rooks and the queen, they're not developed at all, and you have to start with one of them and develop one at a time. So for example, in this position, a move like queen to b6 would be a fine move because you are continuing to make progress, you're continuing to improve your position. This rook on f8 is a little bit hard to develop right now. Actually, after queen b6, it can be easily developed to d8, so well, there you go, you can also develop this rook next move. But this rook on a8 can be developed by moving this pawn to a5 and then advancing it to a4. Once you capture on b3, then the a file is open and this rook is active without you having to move it at all. So when you're in a position like this, look at your pieces, look at which ones are developed versus which ones are not developed, and work on the undeveloped pieces one at a time. Now we will be talking about things that you should be avoiding in the opening, starting with principle number 11, and that is to not bring the queen out early in the game. Now I will show you the most famous example of this, which is the scholar's mate. After e4, e5 here, white plays this move queen to h5. Now queen to h5 is not a good move, it's just a one move attacker attacking e5. Once we defend it here, white plays bishop to c4, but the problem is this queen does not belong on h5. It is out here stranded and it can easily be attacked. You have to be slightly precise, of course. You cannot play a move like knight to f6 because then you get checkmated. However, you can attack the queen with g6. Queen has to retreat, and now you go knight to f6. And let's say white tries to go with a move like g4, trying to attack f7, trying to go g5 and attack f7 here, but we go knight to d4. We use this queen as a piñata to develop our pieces and get them very active. The queen has to go back, and then we play pawn to d5. This is by far the most famous example of why you should not bring the queen out, and that's because it can be attacked. The queen will be attacked with tempo, and you will be able to develop your pieces faster. This is not going to be winning immediately. Well, here it actually is probably. It's minus 3.7, but in a lot of cases, it's not going to be winning, but it will for sure be better for you if white or if your opponent brings the queen out too early and you are able to attack it relentlessly. Principle number 12 is don't move the same pieces twice in an opening. And if you're going to take away something from this video, take this away. Because I've seen too many beginners and even higher rated players, 17, 18, even 2000 players make this mistake of moving the pieces multiple times in the opening. Here, you do not want to be playing moves like bishop to e4, bishop g4, moves like that. You just want to be developing pieces that have not been developed to actually keep making progress in the position. For example, in this specific case, you want to go either knight d7, knight e7, moves like that, maybe even bishop e7 to play f6, and you have to be thinking in terms of making progress and thinking in terms of developing the pieces that have not been developed at all. And this applies to any position. The position that I brought you is Caro-Kann, but it applies to any opening in chess. Principle number 13 is don't create empty threats, and this is also one of the biggest mistakes that I see beginners and intermediate level players making, and that is that they just make moves such as knight to g5, which attacks the f7 pawn along with the bishop on c4, and they do not have any regard for what their opponent might do, because in this case, perhaps they're expecting their opponent to make a move like h6, which is a complete blunder, and it would lose the game immediately. However, in this case, white can simply castle, defend the pawn, and we know, well, I don't know if you guys know, but two pieces for the rook is very situational. Sometimes it's better for the rook, sometimes it's better for the two pieces. Majority of the times it's going to be better for the two pieces, so you do not want to be making exchanges like these, and you do not want to be making moves like knight to g5 that create threats that can be defended very easily and do not actually improve your position, because next move you're just going to kick the round. So what do you do here? Let's say you castle, boom, h6, and now you're back to this position and you've lost a move. Principle number 14 is don't trade bishops for knights for no reason. So in this position, as you can see, bishop g5 was the last move played by white, and here black responds with h6. Do you want to take this knight on f6, or do you want to go back to h4? Well, if you said bishop takes f6, you are mistaken here, because bishops in chess are slightly more valuable than the knights. I know we tell beginners that both knights and bishops are valued at 3 points, but that is simply not true. Well, it is kind of true, but it's a bit more nuanced than that. You need to understand that every chess piece has a relative value, and that value changes throughout the game. And in most cases, bishops are slightly better than the knights. So you do not want to be making exchanges like bishop takes f6 unless there is a very, very specific reason. Principle number 15 is don't create doubled pawns for no reason. So in this position, we already talked about this. This is the same position that we had in the last principle where we play h6 and white captures on f6. However, in this case, we're looking at this from the black's perspective, and which piece do we recapture with? Do we capture with the queen or with the pawn? If you said with the queen, you're completely correct, because this develops the queen and it also keeps the integrity of your pawns. If you capture this with the pawn, you end up with a weak square on f5, you end up with an isolated pawn on h6, and you are in a lot of trouble, and this is not the structure that you want to have in chess. So principle number 16 is don't put bishops in front of your central pawns. And when you play moves like bishop to d3 in this case, what you're doing is you're blocking the pawn on d2, and not only that, more importantly, you're blocking the development of your pieces. If you want to develop this bishop out to this diagonal, you have to move the bishop from d3, push the pawn, and then and only then develop this bishop from c1. If you block your pawns like this, it's more likely that you're going to be forced to play a move like b3 and develop the bishop to b2, which is not what you want to do in a lot of cases. So make sure that if you develop your bishops, you do not put them in front of your central pawns. Principle number 17 is don't make wasteful moves in the opening. Moves like a3 and then h3, these are not moves that address the center. These are not moves that address the development of your pieces. When you play moves like this, it's like you're playing with the black piece. Well, if you're from the white side, it's like you're giving your opponent the opportunity to play with the white pieces because they're going to be up a tempo, even though they're playing with the black pieces. So you do not want to be giving your opponent's tempi for free. You want to play principled, you want to play for the center, you want to play for standard development, and you want to be very disciplined. Making moves like a3 and h3 will only build bad habits, and it will not help you in terms of your chess growth. Principle number 18 is don't close down the position when your opponent is playing a silly opening. A lot of times you will face players who will play these silly fianchetto, double fianchetto systems, and they're ultra solid. They're pushing their central pawns one square forward. They're not really committing any pawns. Perhaps they commit the pawns that don't really matter as much, such as the a pawn. But the thing is, whenever you're playing positions like these, you want to make sure to keep the tension as much as possible. You do not want to be striking in the center with d5 if they can play e5 and close down the position, because in structures like these, black can easily play for their pawn break, which is f5, but white cannot easily get their pawn break, which is c5, because it would take you a long time to set this up, and even if you did, you don't have the help of the b pawn, which is very difficult to accomplish. So what you want to do in positions like these is simply continue developing with moves like bishop f4 or bishop d2. These are all valid moves. Bring the rooks to the center and slowly expand on both sides of the board. You want to be playing even prophylactic moves such as h3. You can afford to make moves like this later on in the game because the position is sort of closed and there's nothing that can happen. That's after you maximize your minor pieces and also develop your rooks and your queen, of course. So make sure that if your opponent is playing a silly opening, don't close the position down. This gives them the opportunity to weasel out of a bad opening. Principle number 19 is if your opponent is playing in the flank, you want to be counter-attacking in the center. So as you can see on the board, we have a very normal Italian opening. And here a lot of players, in order for them to avoid this knight g5 fried liver attack, they play this move pawn to h6, which is not the most accurate move in the position. And the way I want you guys to think about this move is like this. If you open up the center and take the battle to the center, this h6 move is not very useful. You would much rather have the knight on f6, which fights for the central squares. But if the position remains closed down, let's say you play a slow move like pawn to d3, now this h6 move is actually somewhat justified, and it's quite useful when it comes to stopping a bishop to g5, which often pins the knight on f6. So whenever your opponents play on the flank, in order to punish these flank moves, you want to be counterattacking in the center. And this also works in other openings as well. So I will show you one more example. I will skip forward through the opening phase because it's not really what we're talking about today. I will just show you how we got to the position. In a lot of positions here, in a lot of cases like these in d4 positions, Some people play a3. The idea of a3 is to play b4 and control the c5 pawn push, but the a3 move itself is a flank move and it does not deal with the c5 pawn push. Not immediately. It sets up the move that deals with c5, but in itself, it does not address the issue in the center. So the correct move here in this position is pawn to c5, striking in the center. Principle number 20 is develop with threats. So let's say after d4, c5, d5, some players will play silly moves such as this move queen a5, which is just a random check. It doesn't really accomplish anything, but we still need to figure out how to punish moves like these and even early queen attacks. And the way we punish moves like this is we have to develop with threats. So for example, here we play this move bishop to d2, attacking the queen. Queen moves away. We don't even protect this pawn. We simply continue with e4, continuing to develop. Queen takes the pawn, and this is actually a great example of the fact that you should also develop, and sometimes you can sacrifice some pawns in order to get your pieces out as quickly as possible. So here you simply continue with knight to c3. Let's say queen goes back to b6. Now you go rook to b1, attacking the queen and developing the rook with the tempo. And queen has to go back once again. And in chess, development supersedes material most of the time. You would much rather have a very active position than a position where you're up material but you're quite passive, and those positions are actually harder to play. So remember, develop with threats. So principle number 21 is speed of development matters more in open positions. So let's say we have a e4, e5 position, knight f3, knight c6, and here we go for d4, which is the Scotch opening, and then we go bishop c4, which is the Scotch gambit. Now in this case, after knight to f6, we just simply continue to develop. And what I want you guys to realize is that in positions like these, we don't even have to take back the pawn right away. We can delay this, or in a couple of moves, not even take back the pawn. We can simply play a move like c3, allow black to capture the pawn on c3. Now we are down a clean pawn. However, we have so much more development than our opponent. We have an extra pawn in the center of the board. We have the extra bishop, which black does not have developed, the queen, and we are also about to castle. So remember that in open positions, development matters more than anything, and how fast you bring your pieces out matters more than anything. Now, on the opposite note, this is going to be principle number 22. In closed positions, prophylactic moves and taking space is actually quite good. So let me show you an opening where that's the case. Let's say we have a position like this. We have the opening called the King's Indian defense, and here we play knight f3, castles, bishop e2, c5. The opening moves are not as important, but in moves like this where we go d5, we are closing down the position, and let's say e5 is played by black. We don't need to rush here because the position is closed down. Nothing is going to happen right away. So actually, in a lot of cases like this, it's actually better to get the ideal setup rather than bring your pieces out as quickly as possible. For example, we can delay the development of our bishop to play moves like h3, which is a very useful prophylactic move. Also, we can go with a move like pawn to a4, stopping this b5 pawn push. We don't need to develop the bishop right away because it's a closed position. So in closed positions, rules are a bit different than in open positions, and you can take a little bit more liberty when it comes to bringing your pieces out. You don't need to bring them out as quickly as possible. You can take your time and play some prophylactic moves, and oftentimes this is actually for the best. Principle number 23 is going to be aware of pawn structure and pawn breaks in any given position. And once you get out of the opening, you need to be aware of these things. You need to be aware of pawn breaks that are relevant to your opening. So for example, in this position, I have seen far too many people play this move pawn to f4, which is not a very good move. because it opens up the dark square bishop, it also frees up the e5 square for the knight. So this is not a good thing to do. However, it is actually the correct pawn break, but you have to set it up properly with moves like g3 and f4. And for that, you need to understand the opening better. You need to understand what kind of pawn breaks exist in the position out of the opening. Also, you need to be aware of alternative ideas such as a4 and ideas like a5, and here you can set up pawn breaks such as b4. You can move this knight to a4. Let's say a move like queen to c7 is played, you can play a move like a4 and set up this b4 pawn break instead, and this is also very, very powerful because then we can push this pawn to c5 and the position would be fantastic. So you need to be aware of pawn structures and the pawn breaks that are relevant to your opening. Principle number 24 is king is safe in the center of the board if the center is closed. So as you know, in a lot of cases, people tell beginners to castle as quickly as possible when they're in the opening phase of the game. However, that's not really that necessary if the center is closed. And that is because once the center closes down, there is nothing that can attack your king, at least right away. Now, your opponents might try to set up pawn breaks in order to open up the center of the board, and that will create some danger, but that takes time. You're going to be able to figure out a countermeasure in the meantime. So principle number 24 is king is safe in the center when the positions are closed. And finally, principle number 25 is going to be don't push pawns in front of your castled king, because this can create problems for you. So in this case, if you play a move like g4, the black bishop will simply drop back, and after a move like, let's say, king to h2, just getting out of this pin, here black can play this move h5, and you have to deal with this move somehow. You have to push this pawn to g5, because if you just simply allow capture here, that will open up the position, and you cannot play a move like d3. Well, you can, but the problem is there's always going to be h5, and there's always going to be issues here. So avoid pushing pawns in front of your castled king. However, this is also another one of those principles that is a bit situational, similar to knights before bishops. There are going to be some cases where pushing the pawn to g4 is actually going to be beneficial. Most of the time, that's the case when your opponent has also castled their king. So just to let you guys know, try to avoid pushing pawns in front of your castled king unless you have to, or unless you see some very specific line or a very specific idea that will win you the game, or that will give you some sort of an advantage. And that's going to be it for our today's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments if you like these type of videos. I will probably do the middle game principles video next, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.